Listen closely, because this story isn't about power. It's about the moment power becomes helpless. A rich man who controlled half a city installed cameras in his own home to catch a poor maid's children sneaking into his baby's room at night. He expected trouble. Maybe theft. Maybe danger. But what he saw instead broke something inside him that no enemy ever could. A 5-year-old boy sitting on the floor like a guard. A 3-year-old girl singing softly to a baby that wasn't hers. And a lonely child finally sleeping for the first time in months. That night, a mafia boss realized something terrifying. He had everything money could buy, but he didn't know how to love his own daughter. If stories like this touch your heart, subscribe now, because this one will stay with you long after it ends. It started with a man named Reese Dalton. In Chicago, people didn't say his name out loud unless they had to. He wasn't just rich. He was powerful in a way that made even rich men nervous. He owned businesses, properties, connections, but what he really controlled lived in the shadows. And yet, none of that mattered the night his wife died. Catherine Dalton was standing on a sidewalk, holding their newborn baby. The bullets weren't meant for her. But when danger came, she didn't run. She turned and shielded their 13-day-old daughter with her own body. The baby lived. Catherine didn't. From that moment on, Reese Dalton changed. Not slowly. Not gently. Completely. He became colder. Quieter. Harder. The kind of man who didn't just walk into a room. He made the air feel heavier. But there was one thing he still held on to. His daughter. Noah. He loved her fiercely, but from a distance. Like a man afraid that if he got too close, the world would take her too. So instead of holding her, he protected her. 14 guards. Cameras in every corner. A house built like a fortress. But no amount of security could fix one thing. Every single night, Noah cried. Not for minutes. For hours. No nanny could calm her. No doctor could explain it. No amount of money could solve it. Because what she had lost couldn't be replaced. A mother's presence. And then, one day, Sadie Morrow walked into that house. She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. She was a single mother, barely holding her life together. Her husband had disappeared months ago, leaving behind nothing but debt and silence. Not small debt either. The kind that doesn't go away. The kind that follows you. The kind that makes you take any job, no matter how strange, no matter how risky. Sadie arrived at the Dalton estate with an old car, 1 bag, and 2 children. Jonah, 5 years old. Quiet. Watchful. Too serious for his age. And B, 3 years old. Soft, bright, full of life, dragging around a worn-out stuffed rabbit with one ear. Sadie didn't ask questions about the house. She didn't ask why there were guards at the gate, or cameras watching every corner. Because when you have nowhere left to go, you don't ask what's behind the door. You just walk through it. And that's exactly what she did. She became the maid in a house that felt too big, too silent, too heavy. Every hallway echoed. Every door felt like it led to something she didn't understand. But she stayed. For her children. Because survival doesn't leave room for fear. At night, after finishing her work, Sadie would tuck Bee into bed, kiss Jonah's forehead, and sit for a moment in the quiet. She believed they were finally safe. But what she didn't know was that every single night, after she fell asleep, her children woke up. It always started the same way. Bee would climb out of bed, holding her stuffed rabbit. She'd reach for Jonah's hand, and without saying a word, the two of them would walk out into the dark hallway, barefoot, silent, like they had done this 100 times before. They weren't playing. They weren't exploring. They were going somewhere specific. Down the long corridor, past the silent rooms, past the shadows. To the one place in the house no one expected them to go. The nursery. Inside, baby Noah would be crying. Soft at first. Then louder. Then desperate. And that's when Bee would step closer to the crib. She'd grab the railing with her tiny hands, tilt her head, and start singing. Not a real song. Just soft humming, broken words, something only a child could create. But there was something in it. Something warm. Something real. Something no professional had ever given that baby. And slowly, Noah would stop crying. Her tiny body would relax. Her breathing would calm. Until she fell asleep. Right there, under the voice of a poor little girl who had nothing, yet gave everything. And beside the door, Jonah sat on the floor, back straight, eyes open, watching the hallway, guarding, not because anyone told him to, but because he had learned something no child should ever learn. That people leave. That promises break. That if you want someone safe, you protect them yourself. Night after night, he stayed awake, holding that one-eared rabbit like it meant something more than just a toy, like it was part of his duty. And this went on for 23 nights. 23 nights, without a single adult knowing, until one evening, Reese Dalton finally decided to check the camera footage, and what he saw made him stop breathing. But what he did next would change every life inside that house forever. And Sadie had no idea that by the next morning, everything was about to shift. Reese Dalton didn't move for a long time. The screen in front of him had already gone dark, but his eyes stayed fixed on it. Like if he blinked, the moment would disappear. 23 nights. 23 nights his daughter had slept peacefully, while he sat in another room, drowning in silence, thinking nothing could reach her pain. And all it took was a little girl with a broken toy, and a boy who refused to sleep. His fingers tightened slowly against the edge of the desk. He had hired the best people, built the safest home, paid for every solution money could buy. But love, real love, had walked into his house barefoot, and he hadn't even noticed. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, but the air felt heavier now. Not threatening, just honest. For the first time in months, Reese wasn't thinking like a powerful man. He was thinking like a father who had missed something important. Something simple. Something human. And that realization cut deeper than anything else. He closed the laptop gently. Not out of habit, but out of respect for what he had just witnessed. For a few seconds, he just sat there, staring at nothing. Then he pressed a button on his desk. Send Sadie in. His voice was calm, flat. But inside, something had already begun to shift. Minutes later, Sadie stood outside the door. Her heart was racing. She had been called into this room only once before, and even then, she had felt like she didn't belong there. This place wasn't just an office. It felt like judgment. Like decisions were made here that changed people's lives, without warning. She wiped her hands against her apron, took a breath, and pushed the door open. Reese didn't look up immediately. He let the silence sit between them. And Sadie felt it. That heavy silence that makes you question everything you've done, even when you don't know what went wrong. Mr. Dalton, she started softly. Her voice wasn't steady. I don't know how I installed a lock. His voice cut through hers, calm and controlled. She froze. He finally looked up at her. A 6-digit code. Changed every day. His eyes held hers now. Explain to me how 2 children, 1 5, 1 3, managed to get past it. Sadie opened her mouth, But nothing came out. Because she didn't know. She had checked on them every night. B was always asleep. Jonah always quiet. She had no idea what they were doing after she closed that door. "I'll move them," she said quickly, her voice trembling now. "I'll keep them downstairs if I have to. I'll make sure it never happens again." "Stop." One word. Firm. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. Sadie's chest tightened. This was it. She could feel it. This was the moment everything would fall apart. "Please." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Please don't throw us out." For the first time. Reese's expression changed. Not much. Just a flicker. Something small, almost invisible. "I didn't say I was throwing you out," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice. No coldness either. Just something else. Something she couldn't understand. He reached into the drawer slowly, pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. "Look." Sadie stepped forward. Her hands were already shaking as she picked it up. Grainy. Black and white. Night vision. But she recognized it instantly. Her breath caught. B. Her little girl, standing beside the crib, holding onto it with both hands. Head tilted. Mouth slightly open. Singing. Even without sound. Sadie could see it. She knew that look. That soft, serious expression B always had when she sang to something she thought needed comfort. Tears filled Sadie's eyes before she even realized it. But then, her gaze shifted, and her whole body went still. Jonah. Sitting by the door. Back against the wall. Holding that worn-out rabbit in his lap. Not sleeping. Not moving. Watching. Guarding. Sadie felt something break inside her chest. Because she understood. She understood exactly why he was sitting like that. That wasn't just a child staying awake. That was a boy who didn't trust the world anymore. A boy who had learned too early that if he closed his eyes, something might disappear. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold herself together. Reese's voice came again, softer this time. "There's more." He turned the laptop toward her and pressed play. The video began. Be climbing carefully, step by step. So small, so determined. Crossing the room, reaching into the crib, touching Noah's hand. And then, silence. The crying stopped. Just like that. Sadie's knees felt weak. She had never seen anything like it. Not medicine. Not training. Not anything she had learned before. Just a child's touch. B started singing. And beside the door. Jonah turned his head slowly, watching the hallway, then back at his sister, then the hallway again. Over and over. Protecting both directions. Like it was second nature. Like it was his responsibility. Sadie's tears fell freely now. She didn't even try to stop them. On the screen, B adjusted the blanket, clumsy, uneven, but full of care. Then she placed her tiny hand on Noah's back. And stayed there. Just stayed. Until the baby fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The kind of sleep she hadn't had in months. The video ended. The room went silent again. Sadie stood there, trembling. Reese didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was different. Lower. Raw. "My daughter hasn't slept through the night, since her mother died." Sadie looked at him slowly. There was something in his eyes now. Not power. Not control. Something human. "And for 23 nights, he continued quietly, she slept." He paused. "Because saying the next part wasn't easy. Because of your children." Sadie swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I'll stop them." No. He said it immediately. Stronger this time. She froze. Don't stop them. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unexpected. And Sadie just stared at him, not understanding. But Reese wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the desk, his hands clenched tightly together. "The boy," he said quietly. "He stays awake." Sadie's chest tightened again. "He sits there, all night, watching that door." Reese slowly lifted his eyes. "I have 14 grown men in this house." His voice dropped even lower. "Not one of them has done what your son does." Silence filled the room again. But this time, it felt different. Not cold. Not threatening. Just real. "My little girl needed someone," Reese said, almost to himself. "And I didn't know how to be that someone." Sadie felt her breath catch. Because in that moment, the most powerful man she had ever met didn't look powerful at all. He looked like a father who had lost his way. And just outside that room, in a quiet hallway filled with shadows, 2 small children were about to walk barefoot again, toward a baby who was already beginning to cry. Sadie stepped out of the room on unsteady legs, closing the heavy door behind her with care, like she was afraid even the sound might break something fragile inside that space. Her heart was still racing, but not from fear anymore. Not completely. Something else had taken its place. Something she didn't have a name for yet. She leaned back against the wall in the hallway, pressing her palm lightly to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "Don't stop them." The words echoed in her mind. She had walked into that room expecting to lose everything, and walked out carrying something heavier. Trust. Or maybe responsibility. She wasn't sure which one scared her more. From down the hall, she heard it. A soft cry. "Noah." Sadie lifted her head slowly. The sound was faint at first, then grew, fragile, aching, restless. And before she could even take a step, a quiet creak came from the children's room. Sadie turned. The door opened just enough. Bee slipped out first. Barefoot. Sleepy-eyed. Still holding that worn rabbit. Behind her, Jonah. Silent as always. Already awake. Already alert. Sadie didn't move. Didn't call them. Didn't stop them. For the first time, she simply watched. The 2 small figures stepped into the hallway, hand in hand, like they belonged to this routine more than anything else in the world. Bee looked up at her mother for a brief second. There was no fear in her eyes. No guilt. Just something simple. A quiet understanding. Like she was saying, "It's okay." Sadie's throat tightened. She gave the smallest nod. And Bee turned, continuing down the hallway. Jonah followed, but just before he did, he glanced back at Sadie. Not like a child asking permission. Like someone making sure everything behind him was safe, before moving forward. Then he disappeared into the dim light. Sadie stood there alone, her hands slowly falling to her sides. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself breathe. Down the corridor, the nursery door remained slightly open. The soft glow of the nightlight spilled across the floor. Bee stepped inside without hesitation. Jonah took his place by the door, just like always. Routine. Protection. Love, in the only way they knew how to give it. Inside the nursery, Noah's cries filled the space, fragile, desperate. Bee walked closer to the crib, rising onto her toes, gripping the railing. And then, she started to sing. Soft, gentle, broken little sounds that somehow carried more comfort than anything else in that house. The crying slowed, paused, then faded. Jonah shifted slightly at the door, his eyes scanning the hallway. But tonight, something was different. There was another presence there. Reese Dalton stood in the shadows. not moving, not stepping forward, just watching. He had followed them, quietly, carefully, as if afraid that if he made even the smallest sound, the moment would disappear. His gaze moved from B to Noah, then to Jonah. And when Jonah's eyes lifted, they met his. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just watched him, measured him, like he was deciding something. Reese felt it, that silent judgment. Not from a man, from a child. A 5-year-old boy who had already learned how to read people. And for the first time in years, Reese didn't feel powerful. He felt seen. Jonah's gaze stayed on him for a second longer. Then, slowly, the boy gave a small nod. Not welcoming, not friendly, but not rejecting either. It was something else. Permission. Reese understood it without needing words. You can stay, but don't break this. He stayed where he was, one step outside the room, not crossing that line. Inside, B continued singing. Noah's breathing softened, steady, calm, and Reese leaned lightly against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Just listening, just feeling. The sound of that little voice. It filled something inside him he hadn't realized was empty. Not with force, not with power, but with something quiet, something real. For the first time since Catherine died, the house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like something softer, something alive. Bea adjusted the blanket again, her small hands clumsy but careful. Then she placed her hand gently on Noah's back, and stayed there, watching, making sure. Jonah didn't move from the door, still guarding, still present, but his eyes flicked once, toward Reese. Just once. And Reese understood what that meant too. I see you're still here. Don't leave. Minutes passed. No one spoke. No one needed to. Eventually, Bea pulled her hand back, stepping away from the crib. She turned toward Jonah. He stood immediately, placed the rabbit back into her arms, and together they walked out, passing Reese. Bea didn't stop, but she looked up at him as she walked by, her eyes soft, curious, trusting. Jonah slowed for half a second as he passed, not stopping, just close enough. Reese felt it, that quiet test, and then they were gone. Their footsteps fading into the hallway. Reese remained where he was, still, silent. He looked into the nursery one last time, at his daughter, sleeping peacefully. Then slowly, carefully, he stepped inside. For the first time. No guards, no distance, just him. He approached the crib, stopping just short of it. His hand lifted slightly, hesitated, then rested gently against the wooden railing. Noah didn't stir, didn't cry, didn't wake. She just slept. And Reese stood there, staring down at her, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Not fear, not anger. Something softer. Something he had avoided for months. He swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm here. The words felt strange, heavy, like a promise he wasn't sure he deserved to make. But he said them anyway. And as he stood there, in the quiet glow of the nightlight, for the first time, Reese Dalton didn't feel like a man protecting something from the world. He felt like a father, finally stepping into his child's world. But down the hallway, in the darkness of their small room, Jonah didn't lie down right away. He stood near the door, listening, waiting, and only after several long seconds, when he was sure of something even Sadie didn't know yet, did he finally turn back toward his bed. Jonah stood there a moment longer, his small hand resting against the doorframe, his eyes still fixed on the hallway behind him. He wasn't looking at anything specific. He was listening, measuring, waiting for something most people wouldn't even notice. And then, slowly, something in his face changed. Not a smile. Jonah didn't smile much anymore. But something softened. Just a little. Like a guard lowering his shield, not completely, but enough to rest. He turned back into the room. Bea was already curled under the blanket, hugging Mabel close to her chest, her breathing light and steady, like the world had never given her a reason to doubt it. Jonah walked to his bed, climbed in quietly, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't sit up. He didn't lean against the wall. He didn't keep his eyes open. He lay down, still, quiet, and slowly, he closed his eyes. Across the house, Reese Dalton hadn't moved. He was still standing beside the crib, his hand resting lightly on the wood, his gaze fixed on Noah's peaceful face. Minutes passed. Then more. But he didn't feel the need to leave. Not yet. There was something about this moment, something fragile, something honest, that he wasn't ready to walk away from. 4 months, nights had been something he endured. Something heavy. Something empty. But tonight felt different. He finally stepped back, slowly, careful not to make a sound, as if even the quiet could be disturbed. When he reached the doorway, he paused. Just for a second. Then he turned and walked down the hallway. Not toward the vault. Not toward the room where he usually buried himself in work and silence. He walked in the opposite direction. Toward something he hadn't faced in 11 months. His bedroom. The door stood slightly open. He hadn't fully closed it in weeks. Maybe longer. Inside, everything was exactly the same. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been touched. Catherine's presence still lingered in every corner. In the soft fold of the curtains. In the faint scent that hadn't completely faded. In the quiet stillness that felt too heavy for an empty room. Reese stood at the doorway. Not stepping in. Just looking. His jaw tightened slightly. His hand lifted, then dropped again. For a long moment, he considered turning back. Going somewhere safer. Somewhere easier. But then, something shifted inside him. A memory. Not loud. Not sharp. Just her voice. Soft. Warm. Telling him once, a long time ago, that a house doesn't become a home because it's safe. It becomes a home when someone stays. Reese stepped inside. Slowly. Like he was walking into something sacred or something broken. Maybe both. He didn't go far. Just a few steps. Enough to feel it. The weight. The absence. The love that used to live there. He exhaled quietly and sat down on the edge of the bed. The same bed he hadn't slept in since the night she died. His hands rested on his knees, his head lowered slightly. And for the first time in months, he didn't push the memory away. He let it come. The sidewalk. The sound. The moment everything changed. His chest tightened. But he didn't get up. Didn't run from it. Because somewhere, deep inside him, something had started to understand. Pain doesn't disappear when you avoid it. It just waits. And tonight, he was done letting it wait. Downstairs, morning came quietly. The first light slipped through the windows, soft and pale, filling the kitchen with a calm that didn't belong to the rest of the house. Sadie stood by the counter, pouring coffee. This was her moment. The only part of the day where everything felt normal. Before the weight returned. Before reality reminded her where she was. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. Just breathing. Just existing. Footsteps broke the silence. Not heavy. Not hurried. Barefoot. Sadie turned. Reese stood in the doorway. For a second, she didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, but because he felt different. His hair wasn't perfectly in place. His sleeves were rolled. There was a quiet stillness about him, but not the cold kind she had grown used to. This was something softer, more human. They looked at each other, neither speaking, neither sure how to begin. "Coffee," he said finally. Not a question, not an order, just a word. Sadie nodded quickly, turning back to the counter. She poured another cup, placing it gently across from hers. He stepped forward, taking it. They stood there, across the kitchen island, two people from completely different worlds, drinking coffee in silence. But this silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't sharp. It didn't feel like judgment. It felt calm, like something new was trying to find its place. The door opened behind them. Bea walked in first, her curls wild, her pajamas wrinkled, Mabel tucked under her arm. She stopped when she saw Reese, then looked at the two cups, then back at him, and a small smile spread across her face. "You're here," she said simply. Reese nodded. "I'm here." Bea climbed onto the chair with effort, placing Mabel carefully on the counter like she mattered just as much as anyone else in the room. "Mabel's not feeling good," she said seriously. Reese leaned slightly forward, his expression focused. "What's wrong with her?" "Her ear hurts," Bea replied, gently touching the torn part. "And her leg is broken too." Sadie opened her mouth, ready to explain, ready to apologize for not fixing it yet. But Reese spoke first. "I'll take care of it." Bea's eyes lit up, like that was all she needed to hear. Behind her, Jonah stepped into the kitchen. He didn't come forward right away. He stood near the door, watching. Always watching. His eyes moved from Reese to Sadie, to Bea, taking everything in, measuring. And Reese noticed. Of course he did. The boy didn't trust easily, didn't accept easily. But this time, Jonah didn't step back. He didn't turn away. He just stood there, quietly observing. And something about that felt like progress. Small, but real. The morning continued slowly. No rush, no tension, just quiet movement, soft voices, a strange sense of peace settling into a place that had forgotten what peace felt like. But as Sadie stood there, watching Reese speak seriously about a broken toy, watching Bea nod like it was the most important conversation in the world, watching Jonah slowly step closer, a thought crept into her mind. Quiet, uninvited, dangerous. Maybe this place was changing. Or maybe she was the one who was starting to change. And she didn't yet know which one was more dangerous. Sadie didn't say anything after that thought settled in her chest. She just stood there, watching. Reese turned Mabel gently in his hands, studying the torn ear like it was something far more serious than a child's toy. His fingers were steady, precise, not the hands of a man unfamiliar with damage. He ran his thumb along the loose threads, then looked at Bea. "Does she hurt when you touch it?" he asked quietly. Bea nodded with complete seriousness. "Only a little," she said. "But she's brave." Reese gave a small nod, like that mattered. "Then we'll fix her properly," he said. Not casually. Not like a favor. Like a promise. Jonah's eyes shifted at that. He stepped a little closer now, not fully joining them, but not staying by the door either. Sadie noticed. She noticed everything. The way Jonah didn't interrupt. The way he just observed, like he was collecting evidence. And Reese felt it too. He didn't rush. Didn't try to win the boy over. He simply turned slightly, enough for Jonah to see what he was doing. No sudden movements. No force. Just quiet openness. Jonah's gaze lingered on him a moment longer. Then he moved closer, just enough to stand beside B. Not touching, but present. The smallest step. But for Jonah, it meant something. The morning moved on gently. Sadie cleaned up in silence while the children stayed near the island, B talking softly to Mabel, explaining what was about to happen, and Jonah listening without speaking. Reese finished his coffee, placing the cup down carefully. "I'll take care of this today," he said, lifting Mabel slightly. B looked relieved. "Don't make it hurt," she added quickly. "I won't," he replied. And for some reason, she believed him without question. Sadie watched him leave the kitchen with the small toy in his hand. Something about that image stayed with her. A man who could control anything, walking down a quiet hallway carrying a broken rabbit. The contrast didn't make sense. And yet, it did. Hours passed. The house returned to its usual rhythm. But something subtle had shifted. Sadie felt it in the way the air moved, in the way the silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. Even Jonah seemed different. Still quiet. Still watchful. But not as tense. Like something inside him had loosened. Just a little. By the afternoon, B had fallen asleep in Sadie's arms while they walked back to their room. Her small body warm. Her breathing even. Mabel missing from her arms for the first time in months. Sadie laid her down gently on the bed, pulling the blanket over her. Then she turned, expecting to see Jonah watching as usual. But he was already lying down. Eyes closed. Still. At peace. Sadie paused. She stood there for a second, just looking at him. Her chest tightened again. Not from fear. From something else. Something softer. Something that hurt in a different way. She stepped closer, brushing a hand lightly through his hair. He didn't move. Didn't wake. He trusted the moment enough to rest. And that alone meant more than words. Sadie turned back toward B's bed, and that's when she saw it. Mabel, resting neatly beside B's pillow. Sadie froze. She hadn't brought it back. Reese hadn't come upstairs. At least, she hadn't seen him. Slowly, she walked closer, picked it up, and her breath caught. The ear was perfectly stitched. Not with rough thread. Not uneven. Precise. Clean. Almost professional. The leg repaired. Stuffing secured. Seam closed with careful detail. And around Mabel's neck, a small black ribbon, tied neatly into a bow. Sadie ran her fingers over it gently. The fabric was soft. Too soft. Not something you'd find in a regular sewing kit. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, holding the rabbit in her hands. Her mind tried to process it. He didn't just fix it. He took time, care, effort, for something that didn't matter to anyone else, except a little girl. Sadie swallowed hard, because she knew what that meant. Not just the action, but the intention behind it. She stood up and walked out of the room quietly, closing the door behind her. Her steps carried her down the hallway, not thinking, just moving, until she found Pauline downstairs. The older woman looked up as Sadie approached, her expression calm as always. Sadie held out Mabel without a word. Pauline glanced at it, then looked closer. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A pause. Then a quiet understanding settled across her face. "He has a medical kit," Pauline said, returning to her work like it was nothing unusual. Sadie blinked. "A medical kit?" Pauline nodded. "Needles. Surgical thread. Tools." She folded a cloth slowly. "He learned to stitch wounds a long time ago." Sadie's grip on the rabbit tightened. There was something in the way Pauline said it. Something unspoken. Something she chose not to explain. Sadie didn't ask. She didn't need to. She looked down at the careful stitching again. At the black ribbon. And suddenly, that contradiction hit her again. Harder this time. A man capable of violence. A man who lived in a world she didn't understand. And yet, he had sat down and fixed a child's toy with the same hands. With the same precision. With the same care. Sadie felt something shift deep inside her chest. Confusion. Fear. But also something else. Something she didn't want to name. Because naming it would make it real. And real things could change everything. She walked back upstairs slowly, her thoughts heavy, her heart unsettled. When she entered the room, Bea was still asleep, holding Mabel close again. Jonah lay on his side now, facing his sister, like he always did. Guarding. Even in sleep. Sadie stood there quietly, watching them. Her children. Her whole world. And then, her eyes moved to the door. To the hallway beyond it. To the life they were now living. A life she had walked into without asking questions. A life that was starting to feel less like danger, and more like something else entirely. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered something she couldn't ignore. What happens when a man like that starts to care? Sadie didn't have the answer, and that scared her more than anything else. Because somewhere in the house, Reese Dalton was already changing, and she had no idea how far that change would go. That night, Sadie couldn't sleep. She lay on her side, facing the wall, her eyes open in the darkness while the quiet breathing of her children filled the room behind her. Bea had Mabel tucked tightly under her chin, one small hand curled around the newly stitched ear, like she could feel the difference even in her sleep. Jonah was lying still, closer to his sister than before. Not by accident. Never by accident. Sadie stared into the dark, her thoughts moving in slow, heavy circles. Every piece of the day replayed in her mind. The footage. The conversation. The way Reese had said, "Don't stop them." The way he had looked at that photograph, like it wasn't just an image, but something he was still living inside. And then, Mabel. Those careful stitches. That black ribbon. Sadie pressed her lips together. Nothing about this felt simple anymore. Nothing fit into the neat lines she had tried to draw in her mind. Rich man. Employer. Safe house. Those labels were starting to break. Because safe didn't feel like this. Safe didn't make your chest tight with questions. Safe didn't make you wonder if you were standing too close to something you didn't understand. And yet, she hadn't left. She hadn't even thought about packing a bag. That was the part that unsettled her most. Because deep down, a small, quiet part of her didn't want to leave. The baby monitor crackled softly. Sadie turned her head. Noah shifted in her crib. A small sound. Restless, but not crying. Sadie held her breath. Waiting. Listening. But no cries followed. No panic. No desperation. Just quiet. Sadie closed her eyes slowly. Something was changing. Not just in the house. In her. And she didn't know where that path would lead. Somewhere down the hall. Reese Dalton was awake too. He sat in the dim light of his study, the desk lamp casting a soft glow over the papers in front of him. But he wasn't reading. The pen in his hand hadn't moved in several minutes. His thoughts weren't here. They hadn't been all night. They were somewhere else. In a small nursery. In a quiet song. In the steady breathing of a child who had finally found rest. He leaned back in his chair slowly, running a hand over his face. There was a time when nights like this meant control. Planning. Decisions. No. They meant something else. Something unfamiliar. Something he couldn't solve the way he solved everything else. He stood up. Not abruptly. Just when it felt right. And once again, his feet carried him down the hallway. Not toward work. Not toward silence. Toward something softer. The nursery door was slightly open. He didn't step inside right away. He stood there, listening. No crying. Just the gentle rhythm of sleep. His eyes moved across the room. No Bee. No Jonah. Just Noah, peaceful in her crib. Reese exhaled quietly, then turned and walked back. But this time, he didn't feel like something was missing. The next morning came with a quiet kind of normal. Sadie was already in the kitchen when the first light touched the windows. Coffee brewed. Steam rising. That familiar calm settling into the early hours. She didn't expect him. Not really. But when she heard the soft footsteps behind her, she didn't flinch. She turned. And there he was. Again. Standing in the doorway. Less distant than before. Still quiet. Still careful. But present. "You're early," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Just an observation. "So are you," he replied. Sadie gave a small nod, turning back to the counter. "2 cups." Without thinking this time. He stepped forward. Took one. They stood there again, sharing that same quiet space. But something had shifted since yesterday. It wasn't unfamiliar anymore. It was becoming expected. Comfortable in a strange way. The door opened. Bee walked in. Same messy curls. Same soft steps. Same rabbit. But this time she stopped. Her eyes widened. Then lit up. "Mabel feels better," she said immediately, lifting the toy like proof. Reese looked at it seriously. "That's good," he said. "She was very sick." Bee nodded like that made perfect sense. "I told her you'd fix her." Reese didn't smile. But something in his expression softened again. "I'm glad she trusted me." Bee climbed onto the chair, placing Mabel carefully on the counter like always. Jonah entered next. Quieter. More aware. His eyes moved quickly, taking everything in. Then settled on Reese. For a second, neither of them looked away. There was something unspoken there. Not tension. Not exactly trust either. Something in between. Jonah stepped closer this time. Not far, but closer than before. Reese noticed. He didn't react. Didn't push. Just let it happen. Sadie watched the moment carefully. Because she understood what it meant. Jonah didn't move closer to people unless something inside him allowed it. And whatever that something was, it was changing. The morning unfolded slowly. Simple things. Small conversations. Bee talking about Mabel like she was a real patient. Reese listening like it mattered. Jonah eating quietly, but no longer watching every movement like he expected something to go wrong. Sadie moved around them, her hands busy, but her mind somewhere else. Watching. Feeling. Trying to understand what this was becoming. Because it wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just survival. There was something forming here. Something fragile. Something real. And that scared her. Because real things could be taken away. Later that afternoon, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Sadie found herself walking down the long hallway toward a place she had avoided thinking about too much. The study. The door stood slightly open. She hesitated for a moment. Then pushed it gently. Inside, sunlight filled the room. The curtains were open. That alone felt strange. Like something hidden had been exposed. She stepped in quietly, her eyes moving across the desk. Everything looked ordinary. Until something slipped. A photograph. Falling from the edge of an open drawer, landing face down on the floor. Sadie froze. For a second, she didn't move. Then slowly, she bent down, picking it up, turning it over. And the moment she saw it, the air left her lungs. Her hands began to tremble. Because this wasn't just a memory. This wasn't just a past. This was the truth. And it was far darker than anything she had allowed herself to imagine. Sadie couldn't breathe. Her fingers tightened around the photograph as her eyes tried to make sense of what she was seeing, but her heart had already understood before her mind caught up. Catherine, lying on cold pavement, blood spreading across her white blouse. Too much blood. Not one wound, several. And in her arms, a newborn baby. Alive. Protected. Sadie staggered back a step, her shoulder brushing against the desk. The room felt different now. Not quiet. Not safe. Heavy. Like the truth had weight, and it had just dropped into her hands. Everything she had told herself over the past months, every explanation that helped her sleep at night, shattered in an instant. This wasn't just a rich man's house. This was a place built after loss, after violence, after something that had taken a life and left a child behind. Sadie placed the photograph back on the desk with trembling hands. Carefully, like it deserved respect. Or maybe like she was afraid to touch it again. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. The desk. The shadows. The silence. And suddenly, everything made sense. The guards. The cameras. The way Reese watched everything. Like something could be taken at any moment. This wasn't paranoia. This was grief, turned into protection. Sadie swallowed hard. Her chest tightened. Because now she understood something she hadn't before. Reese Dalton didn't just fear losing his daughter. He had already lost everything once. And he was living every day like it could happen again. She stepped out of the room slowly, her mind racing, her heart unsteady. Down the hallway, everything looked the same. But nothing felt the same anymore. That night, Sadie didn't wait. She didn't lie in bed. Didn't pretend things would settle on their own. She walked straight to the study. And knocked. This time, her hand didn't tremble. "Come in," his voice came. She opened the door and stepped inside. Reese looked up. He saw it immediately. Something had changed in her. She didn't stand in the middle of the room like before. Didn't lower her eyes. Didn't twist her hands in fear. She stood still. Steady. "I saw the photograph," she said. No hesitation. No softness. Just truth. Reese didn't react right away. But something in his face tightened. Barely. "That wasn't an accident," she continued, her voice quieter now, but stronger. "That wasn't what I was told." Silence filled the space between them. But this time, it wasn't power. It was honesty waiting to be spoken. Reese leaned back slightly in his chair. His eyes stayed on her. And for the first time, he didn't hide behind distance. "She died protecting our daughter," he said. Simple. Direct. Pain wrapped in calm. Sadie felt her throat tighten. "She took the bullets meant for me." There it was. The truth. Not softened. Not explained. Just real. Sadie exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a moment. Then lifting again. "And the house?" she asked. His gaze didn't waver. "It's built to make sure it never happens again." No apology. No pride. Just purpose. Sadie nodded slowly. Everything inside her was rearranging, piece by piece. Fear. Understanding. And something else. Something she hadn't expected. Respect. not for what he was, but for what he carried. "And my children?" she asked quietly. Reese's expression changed again. Softer. "They're safe here," he said. "Not like a promise. Like a fact." Sadie studied him for a long moment. Searching. Weighing. Then she spoke again. "Why did you pay the debt?" The question hung in the air. Reese didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't simple. Finally, he said it. "Because your son doesn't believe men stay." Sadie's breath caught. Reese's voice lowered. "He sits by that door every night, making sure no one disappears." He paused. "I won't be another man who proves him right." The room went quiet. But this silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't sharp. It was something else. Something that settled deep. Sadie felt tears fill her eyes, but she didn't look away. Because in that moment, she saw him clearly. Not the man people feared. Not the man the world whispered about. Just a father. Trying to do better than he had before. Days passed. Slowly. Naturally. But everything had changed. Not in big ways. In small ones. Reese didn't just stand at the doorway anymore. Sometimes he stepped inside. Sometimes he stayed longer. Bee still sang. But now there was another voice. Low. Unsteady. Trying. Learning. Jonah didn't sit at the door every night anymore. Some nights he stood beside the crib. Not guarding. Just being there. And Sadie watched it all. Not as someone afraid, but as someone beginning to believe. One evening, as the soft hum of Bee's song filled the room, Jonah stepped forward. He hesitated, just for a second, then joined in. His voice wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was there. And Bee didn't correct him. She just smiled and kept singing. Reese stood in the doorway, watching. And something inside him finally settled. That weight he had carried for so long. Shifted. Not gone. But lighter. Because for the first time, he wasn't protecting something alone. Sadie stood behind him, her hand resting gently against the wall. Her eyes on her children. Then on him. And in that quiet moment, she understood something simple. Something powerful. Love doesn't come from wealth. It doesn't come from power. It doesn't come from control. It comes from staying. From choosing again and again, not to walk away. And sometimes, the people who have the least, teach the people who have everything, what truly matters. That night, the house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. And in that home, a broken man learned how to love again. A guarded boy learned how to trust again. And a mother finally felt like she didn't have to run anymore. Because in the end, it wasn't money that saved them. It wasn't power. It was kindness. It was presence. It was love, given freely by those who had nothing to gain. If this story touched your heart, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.